Hi, I'm Zach with FlashCut CNC, and I'm here to demonstrate for you how to retrofit your Bridgeport Series 1 knee mill into a 3-axis CNC machine. FlashCut has engineered a retrofit kit that will install quickly and easily with no machining required. It's designed to work with your existing Acme screw, or we also have an optional ball screw retrofit. This kit will work with the Series 1 Bridgeport knee mill as well as many clones. FlashCut offers both servo and microstepping options to control your machine. Today we will be retrofitting the kit with a servo controller. Other optional equipment includes a limit switch kit for preventing over travel and for homing, a relay box for turning the spindle on and off, a remote pendant for controlling the machine away from the PC, as well as a variable frequency drive for controlling the spindle speed. Alright, the first step is to move the table as close to the front of the machine as possible, so I'm going to do that right now just by turning the hand wheel. And then we're going to want to remove the handle assembly as well as the Y-axis bearing block. So I'm using an adjustable wrench to remove the handle assembly, but it's just, you could use a 3/4 inch wrench to do the same. Just unscrew the jam nut and then remove the handle as well as this dial assembly. Okay, now we're going to remove the Y-axis bearing block, and to do that I'm using a 5/16 hex wrench. And then the assembly just slides off. The next step is to then remove the right X-axis bearing block and handle assembly. And then the rest of the assembly just slides off as the Y did. Now we're going to remove the bearing block, use the same hex wrench. And then just slide the bearing block off. Alright, now we're going to remove the left side X-axis bearing block. It may be necessary to use a gear puller to remove the dial holder, so I'm going to use that right now on this side. And we're off. And then same hex wrench to remove this bearing block. The next step is to then remove the table to saddle gib. So I just need a flathead screwdriver to do that. So to remove the gib, use your flathead screwdriver and unscrew the adjustment screw right under the table here. And then just simply slide out the gib. Now we're going to need to remove the table. So the easiest way to do this is to slide it onto a level surface or use a couple people to actually lift it off. You may need to adjust the knee in order to get the correct height for it to slide off easily, or you could use multiple people to pull it off, but this is quite heavy, so be careful. Okay, the next step is to remove both the X and Y axis lead screws just by unscrewing it from the support housing. Easy way to do this is to actually slide the handle back on that you removed to give you a little easier leverage for unscrewing the lead screw. And now we'll remove the Y axis Acme screw as well. Now we remove the existing support housing to make room for the ball support housing. Now we will want to remove any oil lines attached to the support housing. These will be inserted into the new support housing as well. You just want to be careful not to break them, otherwise they become unusable. Now to remove the support housing, you're going to have to lift and then rotate 90 degrees to slide out of the through hole. Alright, so now we're going to pre-assemble the ball screw assembly. We have to insert the X-axis ball screw into the support housing through this opening here. And then we're going to hand tighten the screws to these two mounting points through the flange. So just slide the ball screw in and then slide it into the support housing. We also want to make note that the two ball returns need to be on the top side. And then just insert the two 5/16-24 screws that are included with the ball screw kit. Now we want to make note that we don't completely tighten down these screws so we can use that play for adjustment later on. Now both the X and Y axis ball screws do not come with the Woodruff key installed, so we've already installed the Woodruff key on both the X and the Y axis thus far. And now I'm going to install this assembly onto the saddle. Make note that the ball nut flange should face towards the left side of the machine. Slide it on, make sure not to pinch any hoses, and then reinstall the 4 bolts that previously held on the old support housing. Now I'm going to tighten these down further, but not completely tight again, so we can align the screws later on. And at this point, I'm going to reinstall the oil line onto the X-axis ball nut here. All right, so now we're going to install the Y-axis ball screw. And to do this, we actually want to screw the nut within 1 to 2 inches of the end, just to give us enough play to actually fish it into the support housing. So we're going to enter through the casting, and then we want to angle it down, and then you have to look inside and then fish it into the support housing. So now I have the screw inserted into the support housing. I'm now going to slide it forward towards me to actually lock it in place and mate the flange with the support housing. Okay, next we will slide forward the 2 chip guards to give us access underneath the saddle, and we're going to loosely attach the 3 mounting bolts to the support housing. Now I'm going to attach the 3 5/16-24 screws to hold the Y-axis ball screw to the support housing. Okay, so I've secured the Y-axis ball screw to the support housing, but I've left the bolts loose so that we can adjust the Y-axis for alignment later on. So now we're going to reattach the Y-axis bearing block and handle assembly, and then work on the alignment for the ball screw. So now I'm just going to screw the ball screw further in so that the bearing block is closer to the casting. Okay, so now that the screw's in this position, I'm going to slide on the bearing block and loosely install the 4 bolts. So now I'll reinstall the handle assembly, and then we're going to slide the X-axis back and forth to try to get the nut to settle in a good position, then we're going to lock it down. Now that the bearing block and handle assembly are reinstalled, we're going to run the axis back and forth to just get the nut to settle into place, and then we'll tighten down the ball nut onto the support housing. And what you're looking for is to have consistent torque throughout the motion. Now that we have the Y-axis ball screw in place, we're going to position the X-axis ball screw in the middle of travel, and then we're going to slide the table back into place, okay? Now that I replaced the X-axis table, we're going to reinstall the gib, and then we're going to mount both bearing blocks, both right and left. So simply slide the gib back in place in between the saddle and the table, and then insert the adjustment pin. And you're just going to use a flathead screwdriver to tighten that down again. So the gib's back in place, and now I'm going to first install the left side X-axis bearing block. Just use the same 4 screws as before and loosely tighten them down. Now we're going to reinstall the handle assembly. Okay, now I've installed the handle assembly and the bearing block on the left side of the X-axis. I'm going to do the same on the right side. Okay, now I have the right X-axis bearing block in place. I'm going to install the handle assembly. And the reason we're installing the handle assembly is so that we can run the X table back and forth and get the nut to settle, and then we'll tighten it down on the support housing. Okay, now that we have the handle assembly reinstalled on the right side of the X-axis, what we're going to do is run the table back and forth to try to get that nut to settle so we have constant torque throughout motion, and then we'll tighten it down. So now the torque required to rotate the screw feels pretty even throughout motion, so I'm going to move the table all the way to the left so that I can tighten down the ball nut. Now the X-axis ball nut is secure. I'm going to secure down the bearing block on the right side of the X table. Okay, now that we have the right side bearing block secured down, I'm going to run the table all the way to the right side and then secure down the left bearing block. Now the ball screw kit has been installed and we're ready to move on and install the motor mounting brackets. The first step is to assemble the X-axis mounting bracket. We're first going to mount the motor on the bracket to make it easier during installation. So first we're going to install the motor. I'm going to prop this up, and then onto the motor we're going to install 4 of these 2-inch quarter 20 standoffs, and we're going to secure them with these quarter 20 button head screws. They all have a washer on the bottom, and we just thread those on. Now we're going to slide on the 10L drive pulley. We're not going to secure it into place currently, but we will do that later when we get the belt installed. Okay, so now that the standoffs are installed onto the motor, what we're going to do is flip this bracket onto the motor, like so, and then we're going to install more quarter 20 by 7/8 screws on the top side to hold it onto the bracket. Now we have the 4 quarter 20 screws installed on the back side. We want to make sure that they stay loose so that we can slide the motor up and down to tension the belt later on. I'm going to flip the whole assembly over now. We will now install the 1032 standoffs, which will hold down the protective cover. So first we're going to install the 2-inch 1032 threaded standoffs on the bottom of the bracket, which is the side closest to the motor. And we will install the 2 7/8 inch long 1032 threaded standoffs on the top side of the bracket, which is the side opposite the motor. So now the X-axis motor mount is pre-assembled and ready to hang on the machine. Next we will do the Y-axis motor mount. So the first step is to prop your motor up, and then what we're going to do is slide these quarter 20 by 1.25 inch bolts from the underside through the motor and secure it on top with a quarter 20 nut. And do that for all 4 mounting holes. And just as with the X-axis, we also want to make these mounting bolts loose so that we can slide the motor up and down to increase and decrease tension later on. Now I'm going to install the 10L pulley, and again this will remain loose so that we can adjust its position based off the belt position later on. Now we're going to install these 1.25 inch standoffs that have a 1032 thread. The 1.25 inch standoffs will go on the top 2 threaded holes, and the top is the opposite of the motor. Now we're going to install these 3/4 inch 1032 standoffs, and those go on the bottom 2 threaded holes, which is on the motor side. Now we have the Y-axis motor mount assembled, and we will move on to the Z-axis. First is we're going to prop the motor up. Then we're going to install these 4 2-inch quarter 20 standoffs using these quarter 20 bolts that are 7/8 inch long. All right, so now I'm going to install the 10L pulley onto the motor. We'll leave this free to slide back and forth so that we can align the belt later on. Now we're going to install the motor plate. So we're just going to lift this onto the motor and secure it with 4 quarter 20 by 7/8 bolts. As with the X and Y axis, we want to make sure that the motor is able to slide on the plate so we can adjust the belt tension later on. Now that the motor is mounted to the plate, we're going to flip it over and install the standoffs which secure the protective cover. So we have 4 2.5 inch standoffs which we will install to the 4 1032 threaded holes. The final 7/8 standoff we're going to install to the my far left of the motor. The Z-axis motor assembly is now complete, and we will move on to installing the motor brackets onto the machine. Now we're ready to install the X-axis motor mount. We already pre-assembled our motor mounting bracket. We also need the protective covering. In addition to, this is our 20L pulley. This is the driven pulley that will mount onto the shaft. This is our shaft extension. This is our shaft spacer. And then this is our timing belt pulley. These are our 3/8 bolts, which will be replacing the current 3/8 bolts that hold the bearing block in place. And then these 1032 screws will hold the protective cover on. The first step to installing the X-axis motor assembly is to remove the handle assembly as well as the 3/8 bolts holding the bearing block in place. Sometimes the dial holders can get stuck on the shaft a little bit, so it may be required to use a gear puller to remove. So now that we have the handle assembly installed, we're going to remove the 3/8 bolts that's holding the bearing block in place. So now I'm going to put in the 1/2-inch spacers into each counter bore, and this just gives us a precise surface which to mount our bracket on. Next, I'm going to slide on our 3/8-inch bolts that are 1.5 inches long. They're a button head bolt with a washer, and they just slide right into the motor mount here. And these will then slide into our 1/2-inch spacers and secure the bearing block as well as the motor mounting bracket. Now that the motor bracket's in place, we're going to assemble our drive mechanism. The first step is to slide on our shaft spacer and just push that all the way until it hits the bearing. Next, we're going to install the pulley. And you want to install the pulley with the flange facing towards you. And just slide it all the way until it hits the spacer. The next step is to install our shaft extension. This will just thread on to the end of the shaft, and then you want to tighten it down till it bottoms out, and then back it off until your keys line up. From here, we're going to slide the dial holder back on. So next, we're going to install the handle and jam nut for alignment. Now that we have the handle and jam nut installed, we're going to install the belt and then position our lower pulley into place and secure them both. Now we want to rotate the handle back and forth to help self-align the lower pulley. Now once it looks like the belt is centered on both pulleys, we're going to go ahead and secure the set screws on both pulleys to lock them in place. We now want to securely mount the motor to the plate, so we're going to push down on the motor to get maximum tension in the belt, and at the same time we're going to secure the mounting bolts on the back side of the plate. Now that the motor and drive mechanism are fixed in place, we're going to remove the jam nut and handle and install our protective covering. To install the protective cover, simply slide it over the wires of the motor and then on top. Then you're just going to pop it over the bracket. To secure the protective cover on the motor mounting bracket, you're going to have to install the 4 1032 screws. Each 1032 screw also has a number 10 hard fiber washer in order to protect the protective covering. So we'll just slide the dial in place, screw on the retainer to hold it in place, and then we'll just install the handle and jam nut. And that's the complete installation for the X-axis motor mounting bracket. Now we're ready to install the Y-axis motor mounting bracket onto the machine. These are the components we'll need to install the Y-axis motor mounting bracket. First, we have the assembly, which we put together earlier with the motor mounted to it. We have our protective cover, our timing belt and pulley. We have our shaft extension, our shaft spacer, our 3/8 mounting bolts, and our 1032 protective cover mounting bolts. The first step to installing the Y-axis motor mounting bracket to the machine is to remove both the handle assembly and the mounting bolts for the bearing block. We're now going to install our 4 1/2-inch spacers. Now we will slide our 3/8 bolts and washers into the mounting bracket and install it onto the machine. With the motor mounting bracket installed, we're now going to install the drive mechanism onto the lead screw shaft. First, we will slide on the shaft spacer. Next, we will slide on the 20L pulley and make sure that the hub faces the machine and away from you. Now that the dial holder is installed, I will now install the handle and jam nut for alignment. By completely tightening this jam nut, what we're doing is we're actually seating the lead screw properly in the bearing to remove any backlash. So this is an important step. Now we're going to install the timing belt pulley. So I'll slide this on the larger pulley, and then on the smaller, you may need to raise the motor in order to get it onto the pulley. Now that the timing belt pulley is installed, we're going to rotate the shaft back and forth to align the belt and thusly align the lower pulley. Now that the belt seems to be centered on the pulley, we're going to lock both pulleys in place. Now the 20L pulley has 2 set screws to lock it in place, and the lower pulley has 1 set screw. Now that both pulleys are locked in place, we're going to put tension on the belt by pushing on the motor and locking the motor into place. Now with the belt properly tensioned, we're going to remove the handle and jam nut and install the protective cover. To install the protective cover, simply slide it on top of the bracket. To secure the protective cover in place, install the 1032 screws and washers. Now the protective cover is installed, we will install the dial and handle assembly. And now the Y-axis motor mounting bracket is installed. Now we're going to install the Z-axis motor mounting plate to the machine. We have the Z-axis protective cover, the driven shaft components, we have the 20L pulley as well as the timing belt. We have a special hex key for getting into tight spaces, our protective cover mounting screws, which are 1032s, and our bracket mounting screws, which are 1024s. The first step we're going to do is assemble the driven shaft. Now we have the 3-inch driven shaft here. It's got a 3/16 keyway machine to it. What we're going to insert is our 1-inch by 3/16 keyway. And then next to that, we will insert a 2-inch long 3/16 to 1/8 step keyway. And this is what actually is interfacing with the pulley. Now let's install the Z-axis motor mounting plate onto the machine. The first step is to disassemble both the downfeed selector switch as well as a downfeed clutch assembly. Now what we're concerned with is the pinion shaft right here is what we're actually coupling to move this axis. So we first have to insert the 3/16 keyway, which is 3/4 inch long. So just press the keyway into the shaft. Now we will slide on a shim to expand the pinion shaft from 9/16 to 5/8. We will now slide the 5/8 inch coupler onto the shaft. Now using our stubby 5/32 Allen key, we will secure the coupler to the pinion shaft. Now that the coupler is installed, we'll slide the driven shaft in there, making sure that the 3/16 keyway slides into the coupler. We will now secure the coupler. We'll now slide the 6 1024 by 5/8 screws, which will hold the mounting bracket onto the machine into place. We'll now lift the motor mounting bracket into place and secure it to the machine. With the motor mounting bracket now installed, we will slide on the 20L pulley. And when installing the pulley, make sure to note that the hub does face you on the Z-axis. We'll now secure the pulley in place. We will now install the timing belt pulley onto the assembly. Now that both pulleys are secured, we'll put tension on the belt by moving the motor up and then secure the motor into place. With the Z-axis motor plate now installed and belt tension, we will now install the protective cover. Simply slide it over the motor and over the plate. To secure the protective cover in place, we'll use our 1032 screws and washers. Now the Z-axis motor plate is completely installed and you now have a 3-axis CNC machine. This is our FlashCut CNC Pro Series servo controller, which also comes in micro-stepping. We're now going to connect our controller to the motors which we've previously mounted and also to the software so we can run the machine. First step is to connect the servo motors to the controller. Now that the motor cables are connected, we will now connect the USB cable from the FlashCut controller to the computer. The FlashCut controller can run off of 110 or 220 AC via this switch here, so we will plug it into 110 right now. After everything gets connected, we flip the box around, we look at the LEDs, and we see that everything's good to go, so now we can connect to the software. So go ahead and go to controller and select connect. And we're now connected to the software and we will move the motors. We'll start out with the X-axis. And now we'll move the Y-axis. And the Z. Now you have a full 3-axis CNC machine with a quick and easy retrofit kit engineered by FlashCut CNC. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to give us a call at 1-888-88-FLASH or visit us on our website at flashcutcnc.com. Thank you very much for your time.